The restaurant was full that evening, filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the faint sound of music playing from hidden speakers. It was one of those places where people came to show off. Fine suits, designer dresses, expensive watches glinting under the golden lights. And in the middle of it all was a young waitress moving carefully between the tables, balancing a tray of drinks while keeping a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her name was Emily, and she had worked there for almost a year. Most nights were the same. Endless orders, fake smiles, and tired feet by the time the clock hit midnight. But tonight something felt different. The crowd seemed louder, more careless. Maybe it was the large group celebrating a business deal in the corner. Or maybe it was just the kind of night where arrogance filled the air more than kindness. Emily tried to focus on her work. She had learned long ago to stay invisible, to keep her head down, take the orders, and avoid attention. But life has a strange way of drawing attention when you least want it. As she made her way to a corner table, one of the guests waved her over. He was in his late 40s, with slicked back hair and a grin that didn't seem friendly. Around him sat a group of people laughing too loudly at every small joke. They were the kind of customers who treated the staff like furniture, something to order around, not people to respect. "Miss, over here," the man called out, raising his empty glass. "Another round for us, and be quick this time." Emily nodded softly, keeping her tone polite. "Of course, sir." She turned to walk away, but before she could take 2 steps, someone at the table made a comment under their breath, just loud enough for others to hear. "She moves like she's walking through mud. Maybe she's too good for this job." The others laughed. Emily pretended not to hear. Her cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She had heard worse before. In this line of work, you had to develop thick skin. Still, no matter how strong you tried to be, certain moments found a way to sting. In the kitchen, she set down the tray and took a deep breath. The cooks were shouting orders. The air smelled of roasted garlic and butter, and the sound of sizzling pans filled the room. For a few seconds, the noise drowned out her thoughts. "Hey, you okay?" another waiter asked while passing by. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. She was tired, not just from work but from life. A few years ago, her world had looked very different. Music had been everything to her. She used to spend hours at the piano, losing herself in melodies that made her forget everything else. Her dream was to play professionally, maybe even teach one day. But when her father fell ill and the bills piled up, she sold the old piano to cover hospital costs. After that, she stopped playing altogether. Now, the piano that once brought her joy was just a memory she tried not to think about too often. Ironically, there was a grand piano in the restaurant, sitting proudly near the small stage in the dining area. It was meant for live performances, but most nights it remained untouched, just another decoration for the rich to admire. When Emily came back out with the drinks, the group that had mocked her was louder than before. They were telling stories, bragging about money and success, while the piano sat quietly in the corner like it was listening. As she approached the table, the man with the slick hair noticed her looking at the instrument. "You play?" he asked suddenly, his tone sharp but curious. Emily froze for a second, not expecting the question. "I used to," she said softly. "Oh, really?" He smirked. "Well, that's interesting. Maybe we should hear you then." The others laughed, thinking it was a joke. Emily forced a polite smile, pretending not to mind. "I don't play anymore," she replied, and started to turn away. But as luck would have it, at that exact moment, one of the glasses on her tray tilted and spilled. Not much. Just a splash of red wine across the edge of the table. Gasps erupted. "Oh, wonderful!" one woman exclaimed, dabbing at her dress with a napkin, though the stain was barely visible. "Can't even carry a drink properly." Emily's heart sank. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said quickly, grabbing a cloth from her apron to clean up. "Careful," another man sneered. "We don't need her ruining the whole place." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and meant to humiliate. Her eyes stung, but she didn't let the tears fall. She kept her composure, whispering another apology before stepping back. Around the room, a few people had started to glance over, curious about the commotion. The man who had been teasing her leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention. "Tell you what," he said loudly so others nearby could hear. "Maybe you can make up for the accident by giving us a little performance. How about it? Let's see if you're as bad at playing as you are at serving." A few chuckles rippled through the nearby tables. Emily's stomach twisted. For a second, she thought of walking away, ignoring him completely. But part of her knew that would only make things worse. People like him wanted a reaction. They wanted her to look small. Her manager, standing near the bar, gave her a warning glance as if to say, just let it go. But something inside her refused. I don't play anymore, she said quietly. The man wasn't satisfied. Come on now, he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Don't be shy. You said you used to play. We'd love to hear something, unless you're afraid to embarrass yourself again. The group laughed once more. Emily turned away, biting her lip hard enough to taste blood. The humiliation burned deeper than she expected. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. Her job depended on keeping calm. Still, as she walked past the piano again, she glanced at it, the way the light hit its polished surface, the quiet dignity it carried. It was almost like it was waiting for her, reminding her of who she used to be. For the rest of her shift, she tried to focus on her work. But the laughter, the comments, the mockery, they lingered in her mind. Every tray she carried felt heavier. Every polite smile felt forced. When the rush slowed down, she found herself near the piano again. Her fingers brushed lightly over the edge of the keys just for a second. The feel of it sent a wave of emotion through her, nostalgia mixed with pain. She quickly pulled her hand back when she realized a few guests were watching. In the reflection of the piano's glossy surface, she could see herself, tired eyes, messy hair, and a uniform that no longer fit perfectly. She barely recognized the girl who used to dream of concert halls and applause. From across the room, the same group still lingered, sipping wine and trading jokes. The man caught her looking again and raised his glass mockingly. "Anytime you're ready, sweetheart," he called out, his voice carrying across the quieting room. Emily gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. She didn't know why, but something inside her stirred. A tiny spark of courage that she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was pain. Or maybe it was simply the need to remind herself that she was more than just a waitress. As she returned to the kitchen, the piano stayed in her mind, echoing like a heartbeat she had tried to ignore for too long. She didn't know it yet. But that small spark would soon turn into something unforgettable, something that would silence every cruel laugh in that room. And as the night went on, the restaurant buzzed with the usual noise of wealth and comfort, completely unaware that before the night ended, everything in that room would change, because of her. The restaurant had started to calm down after the dinner rush. The lights were dimmer now, giving everything a soft golden glow. Couples talked quietly over coffee, and a few regulars lingered by the bar. The noisy laughter from the wealthy table still carried across the room, but it had faded into background chatter. Emily moved between the tables, trying her best to stay invisible. Every step reminded her of the earlier humiliation, but she didn't want to show it. The laughter, the mocking words. They still echoed in her mind, but she kept her head down, pretending it hadn't touched her. She was collecting empty plates when she heard one of the guests call out again. "Hey, piano girl." The sound of that voice made her freeze. Slowly, she turned to see the same man who had mocked her before, his grin wide and confident. He raised his glass toward the piano, sitting quietly at the far end of the room. "Still waiting on that performance," he said. "You said you could play, didn't you?" Emily forced a smile, trying to stay calm. "I said I used to," she replied softly. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "old habits die hard. Let's see what you've got. Or maybe you're scared." The people around him chuckled again. Their laughter wasn't loud this time. It was quieter, sharper, like a knife wrapped in silk. A few guests from nearby tables had started to turn their heads, curious to see what was happening. Emily's heart beat faster. She didn't like attention, not this kind. She wanted to refuse, to walk away. But deep inside, another part of her, the part that had been silent for too long, whispered something different. Maybe it's time. She looked at the piano again. The shine of the keys caught the light, almost like they were calling her. For years she had avoided playing, afraid it would bring back too many memories. But right now, standing there with everyone waiting, she felt something shift inside. She wiped her hands nervously on her apron and said quietly, "All right." The laughter stopped. For a moment, the whole table went silent, as if they hadn't expected her to agree. The man raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. You're serious? Emily nodded. Yes, just for a minute. He laughed again, clapping his hands together. Well, this should be good. Everyone, looks like we're getting a free show tonight. A few people around the restaurant turned their chairs slightly, curious. Even the bartender leaned against the counter, watching. Emily could feel all their eyes on her as she slowly walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The piano sat under a warm light near the center of the room. It was beautiful. Polished wood, ivory keys, the kind of instrument that demanded respect. Emily ran her fingers over the edge for a moment before sitting down. Her hands trembled slightly as they hovered above the keys. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. Her heart raced so fast she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, someone whispered, "This is going to be embarrassing." The man's voice followed, smooth and smug. "Go on then, let's hear it." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her father, how he used to sit beside her when she was a child, how he'd smile every time she played a new tune. He used to say music isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest. So she let her hands fall gently onto the keys. The first note was soft, shaky, barely audible over the clinking of glasses. Then came the second, smoother, more sure of itself. Slowly the sound began to grow. The melody that filled the air was simple, tender like a whisper turned into song. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was gentle, full of feeling. The kind of sound that comes from someone who's lived through pain but still believes in beauty. At first, a few people at the table snickered quietly. But as the tune continued, something changed. The laughter faded. The restaurant seemed to fall under a quiet spell. Emily's fingers moved with grace she thought she had forgotten. Her eyes stayed closed as she played, lost in the rhythm, lost in the memory of who she used to be. Every note told a story, of long nights, broken dreams, and the small strength it took to keep going. The melody grew richer, deeper. The piano seemed to breathe with her, filling the room with emotion that words couldn't express. The guests who had mocked her now sat in silence, their faces softening as the music washed over them. Even the man who had started it all stopped smiling. His eyes followed her hands as they moved across the keys, fast and fluid, each movement natural and precise. He had expected awkward fumbling, maybe a few wrong notes. Not this. The restaurant manager stood frozen near the bar, amazed. He had known Emily for months, but he had never seen her like this. The shy, quiet waitress he thought he knew was gone. In her place was someone powerful, confident, graceful, full of life. A few people began to film quietly on their phones, not out of mockery now, but because they knew they were witnessing something special. Emily didn't notice any of it. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away where there was only her and the music. It felt like coming home after being lost for years. When the last note faded, there was a stillness that hung in the air, like the whole room was holding its breath. For a long second, no one spoke. Then came the applause. It started softly, just a few claps, but quickly grew louder until the entire restaurant was on its feet. People cheered, some even whistled. The same man who had mocked her earlier just sat there, speechless, his drink untouched. Emily stood up slowly, unsure what to do. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She gave a small, polite bow, her cheeks flushed. Someone near the front called out, "Play another." But Emily just smiled shyly and shook her head. She turned and began to walk back toward the kitchen. As she passed the tables, people smiled at her. Some even reached out to thank her quietly. For the first time that night, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as someone to serve, but as someone who mattered. When she reached the kitchen door, she stopped and glanced back. The piano sat there, shining under the light, almost glowing. The people who had mocked her were still talking in low voices, their earlier arrogance replaced with something else, maybe shame, maybe admiration. Emily took a deep breath and went inside. In the quiet of the kitchen, away from the noise, she leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. Her hands still tingled from playing. She hadn't realized how much she missed that feeling, the sense of peace that only music could give her. One of the other waiters rushed in, eyes wide. "That was incredible. I didn't know you could play like that." Emily smiled softly. "I didn't either. Not anymore." He shook his head. "Well, everyone out there's talking about it. You should have seen their faces." She laughed quietly, a little embarrassed. "I didn't play for them," she said. "I just needed to remember what it felt like again." And for the first time in a long while, she meant it. As she stepped back out later to finish her shift, people still whispered and looked at her differently. Not with pity or judgment, but with genuine respect. The man at the table caught her eye as she passed. He didn't say anything, but his face said enough. Emily didn't need an apology. The music had already said everything that needed to be said, and somewhere deep inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, and a quiet, unshakable pride. That night, long after the restaurant closed, she stayed behind for a few minutes. The lights were off, and the piano sat in the dark corner, waiting. She walked over, placed her hand on it once more, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't ashamed of who she was. She had played not to prove anything to them, but to remind herself that no matter how much life had taken from her, the music inside her heart had never truly gone silent. People were still talking about the waitress who had played the piano. Videos from that moment had spread online, shared by guests who had recorded her performance. It wasn't viral yet, but it was enough that strangers started asking questions. Who was she? Does she work there? Some even called the restaurant just to ask about her, but Emily didn't know any of that yet. For her, that night had simply been a moment of release, something she had done because she couldn't take the humiliation anymore. She hadn't meant to make a scene. She hadn't meant to change anything. Still, something deep inside her had shifted. The next evening, when she came to work, the air felt strange. People looked at her differently. Some smiled warmly. Others whispered as she passed. A few regular customers stopped her to say kind words. "Your music was beautiful," one woman told her softly. "You reminded us what real talent sounds like." Emily blushed and thanked her, unsure what to say. She wasn't used to compliments. For months she'd been invisible, just another face behind an apron. But now somehow people saw her, even her manager, who usually only spoke to her about shifts and schedules, called her into his office before the night began. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and admiration. "That was remarkable." Emily smiled shyly. "It's been a long time since I played." He nodded, tapping his pen against the desk. "Well, people are talking about it. We've already had a few calls asking if you'll be performing again." She blinked, caught off guard. "Performing?" He chuckled. "You were amazing, Emily. You made half the restaurant cry, you know that? Maybe you should play once in a while. Just one song at the end of the night. It could be good for business." She hesitated. "I don't know. I wasn't trying to—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "But you have a gift. Don't hide it." She left his office with a strange mix of emotions, pride, fear, disbelief. It felt good to be appreciated, but she didn't want to turn something so personal into a show. That night had been from the heart, not for applause. Still, as she worked through the dinner rush, her eyes kept drifting to the piano. It sat there quietly as if waiting. When the rush slowed, a small group of guests asked if she could play again. At first she said no, but then as the lights softened and the room grew calmer, she found herself walking toward the piano once more. The restaurant grew quiet as soon as she sat down. People whispered, recognizing her. She took a deep breath and began to play. This time the melody was softer, slower, more emotional. The notes floated through the air like tiny ripples across still water. The chatter faded, replaced by that same stillness that had filled the room the night before. Her fingers moved with calm confidence, telling a story through sound, and not about fame or pride, but about the quiet beauty of simply feeling alive. Every note carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. The music touched people differently this time. A couple at the bar stopped arguing and just listened. A man eating alone wiped at his eyes quietly. Even the kitchen staff peeked out to watch her, leaning against the doorway. When she finished, there was that same moment of silence before the applause began. It wasn't loud or forced, and it was gentle and sincere. A few people stood up and clapped. Others smiled through tears. Emily looked around, a little overwhelmed. For the first time in years, she wasn't ashamed of her past or afraid of her emotions. She felt connected, not just to the piano, but to everyone listening. Afterward, as she went back to her duties, people kept stopping her to thank her. "That was beautiful," one man said softly. "It's been a long time since I felt something like that." Even the wealthy guests who had mocked her before came to see her after the show. The same man who had started it all approached her quietly near the door. "Miss," he began, clearing his throat awkwardly. "I owe you an apology." Emily turned to face him, unsure what to say. "I was out of line the other night," he continued. "We all were. I thought it was funny at the time, but you made me realize how foolish that was." She gave a small smile. "It's all right," she said gently. "Sometimes people just forget how words can hurt." He nodded, his eyes soft. "You've got a gift. Don't let anyone make you forget that." After he left, Emily stood there for a while, her heart full. She didn't want revenge or pity. All she ever wanted was to be treated with respect, to be seen as more than just her uniform. In the days that followed, her life slowly began to change. Customers came back asking when she'd play again. Some even brought friends just to hear her music. The restaurant, once known only for its food and luxury, became known for something else, for the waitress with the golden hands. But Emily never let it go to her head. She still served tables with the same quiet kindness. She still smiled at every customer and helped her coworkers when things got busy. The only difference was the spark in her eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. One night, an elderly woman came in with her grandson. She asked if Emily could play something old, something that brings peace. Emily nodded and sat down. She began playing a gentle tune her mother used to hum when she was a child. The melody filled the room with warmth. The woman smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "That was my late husband's favorite song," she said softly when Emily returned to her table. "Thank you, dear. You gave me back a memory I thought I'd lost." Moments like that reminded Emily why she had loved music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection or applause. It was about connection. Sometimes when the restaurant was closed and the lights were dim, she'd sit alone at the piano and play for herself. No audience, no pressure, just her and the sound of her heart in every note. Her coworkers often stayed a few minutes longer just to listen. "It makes everything feel calm," one of them said one night. "Like all the noise in the world disappears for a while." Emily smiled. "That's what music does," she said softly. "It speaks when words can't." And though life wasn't perfect, it felt lighter now. The same place that had once made her feel small had become the stage where she rediscovered her strength. The same piano that had been a decoration became her voice. Weeks passed, and her story slowly spread beyond the restaurant. A local newspaper wrote a small article about the waitress who silenced the room. People started visiting just to meet her, to see the woman whose music had made strangers cry. But for Emily, none of it was about fame. Each time she sat down to play, she played for the same reason she did that first night. Because sometimes when the world feels heavy, music is the only thing that can lift it. And though many guests would come and go, most would leave remembering one simple thing. Not the food, not the luxury, but the moment the humble waitress sat at the piano and made the whole room stop to listen. That was the power she never knew she still had. The quiet strength of a soul that refused to be silenced. And for everyone who heard her play, that strength stayed with them long after the last note faded. The evening had started like any other. The restaurant was warm and lively, but there was a different energy in the air. People seemed more curious, almost expectant. Some glanced toward the piano as they sipped wine, their eyes following Emily as she moved through the room. Emily felt it too. Something had changed in her since the first time she had played publicly. She no longer feared the eyes on her. Instead, she felt a quiet connection to the people in the room, as if the music that had stayed inside her for so long could finally speak for her. The wealthy guests who had mocked her before were there again, sitting with their usual confident smiles. But tonight those smiles seemed smaller, less certain. A subtle tension lingered around them, as if they sensed that the evening might not go the way they expected. Emily carried a tray of desserts to a table near the piano. Her hands were steady, her steps calm. She set down the plates with care and gave a soft nod to the diners, who smiled politely in return. Then, almost without thinking, she found herself moving toward the piano. The moment she touched the keys, the room seemed to grow quieter. Conversation slowed, forks paused midair, and even the clinking of glasses softened. People didn't fully understand why, but they felt that something important was about to happen. Emily's fingers hovered over the keys for a brief moment. She closed her eyes and let the memories of her past guide her. Every note she had learned, every song she had practiced in the long hours of solitude came rushing back. She didn't plan a melody. She let her hands move naturally, letting the music flow as it wanted. The first notes were soft, almost like a whisper. Gentle, tender, full of emotion, the melody grew gradually, carrying a sense of longing and hope, of sorrow and courage all at once. It was impossible not to feel something when listening, a connection that went beyond words. At first, the diners at the tables far from the piano only noticed the sound faintly. But soon even the most distracted guests turned their heads. The same wealthy patrons who had laughed at her began to sit up straighter, their expressions changing as they realized that this was not a simple performance. Emily's music filled the room, wrapping around every corner, touching every heart. The sounds weren't just notes, they were stories of perseverance, of quiet strength, of a life that had known hardship but refused to break. Each chord carried meaning. Each pause held a gentle weight. People began to feel emotions they hadn't expected to feel in a restaurant that night. A businessman who had been focused on his phone now leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as the music reached him. A young couple held hands across the table, letting the melody speak for feelings they couldn't put into words. Even the restaurant staff stopped briefly to listen, their own busy thoughts quieted by the beauty of the piano. The wealthy man who had mocked her before shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His friends whispered quietly, their voices subdued. He had expected awkward fumbling or hesitant notes, but what he heard was mastery. Controlled, expressive, and full of life. Each moment of the performance seemed to strip away the arrogance in the room, leaving only a raw, honest connection to the music. Emily didn't look at anyone as she played. She didn't need to. Her eyes were closed, her heart completely focused on the piano. The room became a silent witness to her journey, and she let herself play every note with honesty. She felt the music rise and fall, filling the space with emotion. She felt the power of the piano beneath her fingers, a strength that had been with her all along but had been hidden, waiting for this moment. As the music swelled, a few people in the room began to cry quietly. They didn't try to hide it, but neither did they draw attention to themselves. Their tears were gentle, a reflection of the emotion that Emily's playing had stirred in them. The wealthy patrons who had been mocking her felt a mix of awe and shame. They hadn't expected to be touched so deeply, and their discomfort grew as they realized how wrong they had been to laugh at her earlier. The melody shifted slightly, growing more hopeful, more uplifting. It wasn't just sorrow anymore. It was resilience, courage, and quiet triumph. The people listening could feel it, and the atmosphere in the restaurant began to change. Where there had been arrogance and laughter, there was now stillness, respect, and wonder. Some guests began to lean closer, drawn by the emotion in the music. Others whispered to their companions, pointing subtly toward the piano. Emily didn't hear any of it. She was lost in her own world, the notes guiding her fingers, telling her story. When the final notes played, there was a pause so complete that it felt almost like time had stopped. The sound lingered in the air, and the room remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly the first claps began. Soft at first, hesitant, unsure, and then the applause grew. People rose from their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes, some smiling broadly. The wealthy patrons who had mocked her were standing too, a mixture of astonishment and humility on their faces. They couldn't look away, couldn't deny what they had just heard. Emily sat quietly, her hands resting lightly on the keys, breathing steadily. She wasn't seeking applause, but she accepted it quietly, letting the room honor the music she had poured her heart into. She looked around, taking in the faces of strangers who had suddenly become witnesses to something far greater than herself, something that no one could have anticipated. The manager came forward, his eyes wide with admiration. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." Emily smiled faintly, a little embarrassed. "Thank you," she said softly. The guests approached her one by one. Some offered quiet words of praise. Others shook her hand, their expression sincere. Even the man who had mocked her before extended his hand, his voice low. I misjudged you," he said. "That was incredible." "I'm sorry for laughing," Emily nodded politely. She didn't need to hear more. The music had already done what words couldn't. It had changed their perception, softened their arrogance, and left them in awe of her talent and heart. For the first time, she realized that her music wasn't just for herself. It had the power to reach others, to touch them deeply, to make them see something they might never have noticed, the quiet strength and beauty in someone they had overlooked. As the evening went on, people lingered near the piano, asking if she would play again. Emily continued her work, but she carried a new energy with her. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a calm confidence that had been missing for years. Even after the restaurant emptied for the night, the memory of that evening stayed with everyone who had heard her play. The wealthy patrons left more thoughtful than they had arrived. The staff carried a quiet pride, and Emily herself walked home that night with her heart full. She knew that something had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone who had listened. Music had the power to change people, to humble them, to make them feel, to connect them to something real. And she had used that power without meaning to. Sitting alone in her small apartment later that night, Emily thought back to the piano, to the way the room had fallen silent when she played. She smiled to herself, remembering the faces of those who had laughed at her and how they had been transformed by the sound of her music. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt whole. She had faced humiliation, fear, and doubt, and she had risen above it. Her music had spoken for her when words could not, and she knew that tomorrow and the day after, the piano would wait for her again, patient, silent, ready to carry her story into the hearts of everyone who would listen. The power of a single song, played from the heart, had changed everything in that room, and Emily, the once shamed waitress, had finally found the courage to embrace her gift fully. The restaurant was unusually quiet that evening, though the air was filled with anticipation. People who had heard about the waitress's music had returned, curious to experience it again. Even those who had been skeptical the first time lingered near their tables, glancing at the grand piano in the corner with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Emily moved through the room with the same calm grace she had shown in the previous performances. She carried trays of desserts and coffee, smiling politely at the guests, but her mind kept drifting toward the piano. Each glance reminded her of the power she held within her hands, the voice she had almost forgotten. As she finished setting a plate at a nearby table, a voice called from across the room. It was the same man who had mocked her on that first night. This time, however, his tone lacked arrogance. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly. "The room is waiting." Emily looked at him briefly, then at the piano. She felt a flutter of nerves, but also a deep sense of purpose. She walked slowly toward it, letting the soft light glint off the polished wood. When she sat down, she placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling their smooth surface beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a moment, all the noise and chatter faded. There was no fear, no doubt, only the music and the story it wanted to tell. The first notes were tender, flowing like a gentle stream. The sound wrapped around the room, quiet at first, then swelling with emotion. Emily's fingers moved naturally, guided by memory and feeling rather than any written music. Every note was a piece of her heart, a reflection of everything she had endured, humiliation, doubt, struggle, and the quiet strength that had kept her moving forward. The audience was mesmerized. Conversations had completely stopped. Guests leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on her hands as they danced across the keys. Even the wealthy patrons who had mocked her were silent, their usual confidence replaced with awe and humility. Emily let the music grow, letting it carry her story into the room. The melody shifted and swelled, moving from sorrow to hope, from tension to calm. Each note spoke of resilience, of the courage it takes to face life's challenges, and the quiet beauty of never giving up. The room was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a space of connection, of shared humanity, where every listener felt a part of her journey. Some guests wiped at their eyes quietly, moved by the depth of feeling in the music. Others sat motionless, their attention fully captured. Even the staff, who had worked alongside Emily for months without ever seeing this side of her, were drawn near, leaning against counters or peeking from behind doors just to witness the magic. The wealthy man who had mocked her from the beginning shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His friends watched silently, unable to speak. He had expected awkward fumbling, not this mastery, not this raw, unfiltered talent. With every chord he felt his arrogance dissolve. He realized that his laughter, his cruelty, had been misplaced, and for the first time he understood the weight of words and the power of genuine talent. Emily didn't notice their reactions. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing to express herself, to reclaim a part of her life she had almost lost. The music wasn't just sound. It was her voice, her truth, her history poured into every note. As the melody reached its climax, it was impossible not to feel the emotion. The room seemed to vibrate with it, hearts beating in time with the music. Tears streamed quietly down the faces of some guests. Others sat frozen, struck by a beauty they could not explain. Even the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation had completely vanished, leaving only the purity of the piano and the story it told. Then, as the final notes lingered in the air, there was a silence so complete that it felt sacred. The music had ended, but its echo remained, touching everyone who had listened. The room held its breath, not wanting to break the moment. And then, the applause came. It started softly, a few hesitant claps from those closest to her. But quickly the sound grew. Guests rose to their feet, some cheering, some whistling. The clapping swelled, filling every corner of the restaurant. People who had been strangers moments before now shared a profound moment together, connected by the music that had transformed the room. The wealthy patrons who had laughed at her earlier stood as well, some awkwardly, some with genuine respect. The man who had mocked her approached slowly, extending his hand. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. I didn't understand before. That was incredible. Emily smiled politely, her heart calm. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. The manager, standing near the bar, shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anything like that, he said. You've changed this place tonight. You've changed everyone here. Emily returned to her seat, letting the music of her performance linger in her memory. She wasn't used to this attention, and though it was overwhelming, it didn't frighten her. For the first time, she realized that the courage she had found that first night hadn't been a one-time spark. It had grown, becoming a steady flame that she could carry with her. The audience slowly began to quiet down, whispering among themselves. People approached Emily one by one, offering thanks, admiration, and kind words. Some brought their hands to their hearts, others shook hers gently. The restaurant had never felt so alive with genuine emotion, so full of connection, so human. Even the youngest guests, who had been playing quietly at the tables, looked up with wide eyes, amazed by the sound that had filled the room. They didn't fully understand the story, but they felt its truth, the beauty of courage, the power of talent, and the joy of witnessing someone follow their heart. Emily stood and gave a small bow, acknowledging the applause without seeking it. She felt a deep sense of peace. The shame and embarrassment that had haunted her on that first night were gone. She had faced the ridicule, embraced her gift, and shared it with the world in the most honest way possible. As the guests began to leave, many lingered, speaking quietly about the performance, their voices filled with admiration. Some promised to return, eager to hear her play again. Others left thoughtful, carrying the memory of that night with them, changed in a way that was quiet but profound. The man who had mocked her approached one last time before leaving. You've taught me something important tonight, he said. Talent isn't just about skill, it's about heart. And yours is extraordinary. Emily nodded, a faint smile on her lips. She didn't need more praise. The music had already spoken for her, and it had been heard. After the restaurant emptied, she stayed behind, sitting at the piano alone. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips. She didn't play this time. She simply sat and let herself remember the power of the night. She thought of every moment, the laughter, the mockery, the courage it took to rise above it, and the connection she had created. The piano had not just been an instrument, it had been a bridge linking her heart to everyone who had listened. For the first time in a long time, Emily didn't feel small or invisible. She felt whole. She had taken something meant to humiliate her and turned it into a gift, not just for herself but for everyone who had heard her music.